Did you hear that? Recording in progress. And lastly, if you enjoy these virtual programs that the library offers and would like to support us in continuing to host them, you can find in the chat box a link to our donate page on our website. Any and all donations are very much appreciated, and we thank you. Now, I will introduce you to the authors. Sabia Raymond is the author of the memoir, Threading My Prayer Rug, One Woman's Journey from Pakistani Muslim to American Muslim, which was a finalist for the William Saroyan International Prize for Writing. The book also received the San Francisco Book Festival Award and was listed as one of the top 10 religion and spirituality books, and also one of the top 10 diverse nonfiction books, both cited by Booklist. So Sabia Raymond is a blogger and a public speaker. She is an op-ed contributor to the Wall Street Journal and has published articles in Forward and Salon.com. She lives with her husband in New York City. The co-author, Walter Ruby, is a veteran activist in Muslim-Jewish relations who has organized hundreds of twinning events, bringing together thousands of Jews and Muslims in more than 30 countries around the world. Mr. Ruby served for decades as a reporter and commentary person for American Jewish and Israeli publications. His articles and op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, and USA Today. He lives with his wife in Frederick, Maryland. And now I'm going to leave it to you, wonderfully talented people. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Erica. Good evening, everybody. Erica, thank you for inviting us. And I see my friend Tony Siegel is here, who first brought me to the David Hunt Library. Hi, Tony. I grew up in Pakistan. In those years, I had never met a Jewish person. Pakistan is pro-Palestinian, and to this day, Pakistan has not recognized Israel. As a result, I always viewed Jews through the lens of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, my father's passport was stamped all countries of the world except Israel. And that is literally and figuratively where I came from when I came to the United States in 1971. Walter, had you ever met a Muslim person?
Well, Sabeeha, I never met a Muslim until I was well into my 20s. And let me just also stop and say thank you all so much for inviting us, and really happy to be with you in your beautiful village, which I visited once and had fond memories of. So I never met a Muslim until I was well into my 20s, even though I grew up pretty much of a lonely Jewish kid in a predominantly Gentile suburb of Pittsburgh. But at the age of 11, we actually moved to Israel for a year. My family did. When I was at the age of 11, my father had a sabbatical year at a scientific institution in Israel. And that was a life-changing year for me, clearly. I really bonded with Israel and felt deeply at home and connected to my true self as a Jew. So that was really very powerful. But it's interesting that looking back, even though there were obviously Arabs and Palestinians, Muslims and Christians there, I didn't meet any of them at that time. We lived completely, Jews and Israeli Jews and Arabs lived completely separately. And we went back to the US after 1 year, my family did, but I was very upset. I wanted to live in Israel. So I said, I'll move back when I'm grown up, because this is where I know I would be happy.
So please excuse me for my allergies. My apologies. The first time I met a Jewish person was when I came to the United States. It was December 1971. My husband was a medical resident. The hospital had a Christmas party. He took me there to introduce his new bride to all his colleagues. Half of the residents were Pakistani Indian and the other half were Jewish. And his Jewish colleagues were being very welcoming to me. Are you lonely? Do you miss your family? How can we be of help? And I had difficulty reconciling my negative perception of the Jewish people with the reality that I was facing. Then I find out that the neighbor who lived upstairs, who had taken me under her wing and was showing me the ropes, was Jewish. My husband's boss, who was mentoring him, opening doors for him, was Jewish. In fact, he worked at Long Island Jewish Medical Center. When I got pregnant, my obstetrician, Jewish. I have a baby, the pediatrician, the nice pediatrician, Jewish. And then I buy a house in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. I had no idea what I was getting into, liked the house, bought the house. My father, who was visiting, was very impressed by the families that he saw on the Saturday mornings walking to the temple. And he said to me, this community is going to be good for your children. People of faith, no matter what their faith, raise their children with good values, and your children will benefit from this. Well, not only was he right, but I also got a bonus out of it. I no longer had to tell my children why I don't have a Christmas tree. Walter, what about your first encounter with a Muslim or
Sure,
an Arab?
Sabia. I moved back to Israel at the age of 26, as I had promised, vowed that I would. And I stayed there for 3 years, which were, I'd say, the happiest of my life. Part of it was that I got into journalism while I was in Israel, and that was fantastic. And I loved doing that. And I covered many stories. I was based in the city of Haifa, which is in the north of Israel, and where you have a pretty large population of Arabs, Israeli Arabs, so I was covering stories. I was covering in Israeli papers about what was going on in those villages, and I learned a great deal that I hadn't known before about the systematic discrimination that was endured by the Palestinians, in many ways second-class citizens. I also learned even more importantly, for my life story, I learned a very important life lesson in the visits to many of those villages, which was the transformative power of personal encounters. I mean, I had very few encounters. These were my first encounters, obviously, with Muslims, Christians, Palestinians, and I've been trained to think of them as the enemy, for lack of a better word. And here these people were coming to life. And they were so moved by my coming, even though I came as a journalist, not necessarily a friend. Maybe I left as more of a friend. They invited me for dinner. We had incredible conversations. They were so touched that I had come there as a Jew to learn about them and to report, honestly about what I read. But many of my Israeli Jewish friends, when I would tell them about this, they would sort of roll their eyes and they would say, Walter, you're a nice guy, but you don't get what's going on here. You're a naive American, and you're only here for a year, and you're telling us, how things run. Listen, we know the Arabs. You don't know the Arabs, and we know they're out to get us, essentially. One of the people who said similar things was a hero of mine. He was my uncle, Zev Sharon, and he lived on a kibbutz, not that far from many of these villages. He was a wonderful man. He'd fought in Israel's War of Independence, and I kind of hero worshipped him. And then suddenly, though, here we were a little bit at odds because, and I'll read a little bit from the book, that I was talking to him, and specifically he and his wife, about a priest, a Greek Catholic Israeli Arab priest or Palestinian priest named Father Elias Shakur, who was a social activist, was organizing people in the village to work together to build their community center, to when they weren't getting the funding, let's do it ourselves. Anyway, he touched me a great deal, and so I was telling. So one day I was talking to my uncle about Father Shakur, and suddenly it occurred to me that the village is only 10 or 15 kilometers from the kibbutz, and I said, well, Zev, have you ever been there? Have you ever been to Ibalin, where Father Shakur is from? And he said, of course I have. And I said, oh, like, when were you last there? And so then he thought a bit and he said, you know what? As far as I recall, I was there once in 1943. Now, this conversation is taking place in 1977. So he saw my eyebrows go up about that, but he responded forcefully, Yeah, so it's been a while since I've been there. So what? Don't think for a moment that just because you were there a few weeks ago and got sweet talked by that priest of yours that you understand the Arabs better than I do. Listen, I don't need to go to Ibilin to meet Shakur and the others to understand what they want, which is to destroy the state of Israel as soon as they can. And one way they're trying to accomplish that is by pulling the wool over the eyes of dreamers like you. So that was the attitude. But Zeb said that, but almost all of the other people who also told me they knew the Arabs had never been to those villages or had passed through once and gotten, filled their car with gas or something. That was the difference. I understood that, look, I'm not an expert, but I know, I think I can know people, and so it's told me that that's kind of what I wanted to, a big part of what I wanted my life to be about, is reaching across those barriers and meeting the other and connecting and transforming the picture that way. Sabeeha?
So I started reaching across the others. It happened organically. I had not planned it. I used to be hanging out with my Jewish neighbors on the sidewalk. We were watching our children. I was a homemaker raising two boys in the 70s. And we'd be chatting, standing on the lawn. I guess that's where grassroots movement came from. I must have invited one of them over for dinner, and the conversation may have gravitated towards dietary restrictions. And now we are saying, oh, so you don't eat pork either. She must have invited me over for coffee, and I would have said, I'm sorry, but it's Ramadan. What is that? And that's how literally interfaith dialogue started. At one point, it occurred to me that it would be really nice if my Jewish neighbors could meet my Muslim Pakistani friends, because I didn't want my Jewish friends to believe that I was unique in some way and that I was not like the rest of them kind of Muslims. And I also wanted my Muslim friends to see how wonderful these Jewish families are. So we started meeting in our home, in our living room, and eventually that led to larger meetings in public spaces. And that is actually how, for me, interfaith dialogue started from the grounds up. Now, for Walter, it was more top down for you, right? You were with the rabbis and the kings and the statesmen.
Right. Well, first of all, as I mentioned before I got into it, as a journalist, and I continued to work as a journalist for about 30 years, actually, and mostly I left Israel in the end of the 70s, and I spent most of the next 25 years based in New York, some part of that time at the United Nations, covering the Israeli-Palestinian peace process worldwide for Israeli and Jewish newspapers, as Erica said. And so I identified very deeply with that, and I thought I was witnessing history, that I was, and that we would get a happy ending, that this was my life's work to kind of chronicle this thing. But then the peace process collapsed in the beginning of the 2000s, and that was a very traumatic blow for me. And I was kind of bereft for a few years. I became interested in Muslim-Jewish coalition building in the US as kind of an alternative path to peace and reconciliation. And then in 2008, I was hired by an old friend, Rabbi Mark Schneier, the president of the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. He said, I want you to be my Muslim-Jewish program director at the foundation. Okay, I get very excited until I got the job. And I said, well, what does a Muslim-Jewish program director do? And I really had no idea, because I was probably the only one in existence. So I had to sort of make it up. And so what I ended up mostly doing, Erica mentioned the word twinning, she put in parens, and that's what I did. I twinned rabbis and imams. I brought together rabbis and imams so that they could do twinning events between their mosques and synagogues. And also, let's say, on campuses, we twinned Muslim and Jewish student groups, and we did women, Muslim and Jewish women's groups. And so that was my job. I was like a matchmaker. And I did that for close to 10 years. And, sometimes people when I would meet strangers, maybe on a plane, they'd ask me what I do for a living. And I would say, I twin Jews and Muslims. And first they would look at me like they were, thought I was a little off my rocker. And then after they saw that I was serious, they say, they would go like, oh my God, that must be the worst job in the world. And I said, no, with deep passion and conviction, this is the best job in the world. I mean, I feel so incredibly fulfilled with what I'm doing. It's going so much better than I even imagined it would. And to have the opportunity to bring these amazing people together and watch them build their relationships. I mean, one-to-one, and then, then those, the one-to-one bringing more, and then, you've got a congregation to congregation. I mean, it was, and watching these bonds, I mean, it really felt like holy work in many ways for me.
So the holy work had some ground rules. Walter and I were operating in different lanes, but we had the same rules, that we will focus on our commonalities, things that bring us together, our shared history, our shared values, and we will keep politics out of it. In fact, I belong to the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, where the guidelines were that once a chapter of the sisterhood is formed, for the first 18 months, you will not discuss politics. Allow time for relationships to develop, for trust to develop. So for the first 18 months, we did not discuss politics. And then after 18 months went by, we still did not discuss politics. Another 18 months went by, we still did not discuss politics. Things were going so well that nobody really wanted to rock the boat or wade into murky waters. Then about 2 years ago, the sisterhood decided that now was the time, and we need to confront the issues. So they set up a committee, a Muslim, Jewish, is an Israeli Palestinian committee, to come up with a statement, to come up with some definitive guidelines. They started doing training on conflict resolution, on facilitation. And then this year, when the conflict erupted in April, which is just at the time when our book came out, we did have these conversations. And it was in some chapters when these conversations were held, following the guidelines, things worked out very well. But in some chapters, it fell apart. Relationships unraveled, and some chapters had to go on a hiatus. There were people, members of the sisterhood, who left the sisterhood. The Muslims left the sisterhood because they felt that the Jewish members had been silent when the conflict was going on. The Jewish sisters left the sisterhood because they felt that the sisterhood was too pro-Palestinian. Most of them stayed. So there were a few who left, but most of them stayed. And so the sisterhood had to go back to the committee, re-examine their strategy, and then they started conducting webinars. And they're still doing that and have gotten more proactive in managing this process of confronting the issue and having a dialogue. The jury's still out on it. This is a work in progress, but it has been a challenge. But coming back to where we had left off from, Walter, tell us about how our paths crossed.
Sure. So in 2010, well, in the process of my work with reaching out to Muslim organizations and forming these bonds, I reached out to a well-known woman named Daisy Khan, who is the president of or was the president at that time of this American Society for Muslim Advancement. So I called her, but Sabeeha answered the phone, and who I hadn't known until that point, and we started to chat. She worked very closely with Daisy, and so we developed a friendly relationship and saw each other at different events. But I have to say that at that point, we had no idea really where this relationship would lead us.
So where this relationship led us is that in 2016, my memoir, Threading My Prayer Rug, was being published. And it occurred to me that it would be good to have an endorsement from a rabbi. And I thought of Walter, who is not a rabbi, but he worked for Mark Schneier, Rabbi Mark Schneier. So I wrote to Walter. I was in Pakistan visiting family. I emailed him and I said, Walter, I have written this book. Do you think that Rabbi Schneier will be willing to write a blurb? And Walter's response was appropriate. I have to read the book. I emailed him the manuscript And this nice Jewish gentleman spent his day of rest on Saturday reading the whole manuscript, writes back to me and says, Sabeeha, the rabbi will be happy to write a blurb. And I have an idea. Why don't the two of us write a book? Walter, why did you come up with that idea? What was the idea?
Well, I sat down on that Shabbat, that Saturday, to read your book, sort of a little unhappy because I was like, as she said, this is my weekend, but it was my fault because I had promised and I hadn't, gotten there in time. So anyway, I had to read. I fell in love with the book, and I thought it was her book. It's absolutely marvelous, as you know. So I don't have to sell it to you guys because you heard her already a couple of years ago there. So you know what I mean. But I also, I've been looking for a while for a Muslim co-author because I wanted to write a book about our movement for Muslim-Jewish reconciliation and alliance building. And, I hadn't found the right person before this. But I said, well, first of all, she can write. So that's really important. And I like her values. And also, so I said, okay, so if I can convince her to do this, here's what I want this to be about, because at this point, we're in 2016, going into 2017, and I saw now that the stakes had kind of become higher, and that I wanted our book to be a manifesto, in part about why this alliance, Muslim-Jewish alliance, is so needed at this moment in history, when both our communities were and are feeling threatened by the rise of bigotry and authoritarianism. And I felt that as the two largest religious minority communities in America, we need to stand together in support of democracy, human rights, and religious freedom for all Americans, but also with the understanding that those values are absolutely critical to make Muslim and Jewish life viable in this country. So Sabeeha thankfully accepted, let's try. So we sat down with a tape recorder in the early months of 2017 in her apartment. I'd since moved down to Washington, so came up. We identified very quickly 4 principles that we feel undergird both our book and the larger movement that we've been part of. So I want to share them with you very quickly. So the first one is the precept that the precept of if you save one life, it is as though you saved the world. And this principle is very, very basic to both of our faiths. It's in both of our holy books, the Quran and the Talmud, and I think that it illuminates in a very, very powerful way the commitment to mercy, compassion, and justice, and the preciousness of every single human life in a very powerful way. But the other point about it is that I had no idea until not long before that it was in the Quran, and that the same line was in the Quran. Sabeeha hadn't known it was in the Talmud, and I would venture that even now, the vast majority of Jews have no idea it's in the Quran, and vice versa. That most Muslims don't know it's in the Talmud, that it's part of Judaism. So it shows it's just such an important precept, but it also shows us these kind of ties, that our religions kind of sprang up from the same source, going back to Abraham, and that's something we'll talk a little bit more about as we go along today. Sabeeha, you want to talk about the second?
Yeah, the second principle that unites us is welcome the stranger. It is ordained in the Quran and it is ordained in the Torah. Both our mothers were refugees. My mother left India when it was partitioned into India and Pakistan in 1947, just a year before Israel was formed. She got on a train with her family to go into Pakistan to cross over. And on the way, the trains were attacked by mobs. Thousands of people were massacred. She barely made it across, and she was welcomed in her new land. And there she lived, there she thrived. And she believed until her dying day that if there was one place on God's earth that was made for her, it was Pakistan. Now, fast forwarding to 2016, and the presidential election has taken place. And now we Muslims in the United States wonder whether we can even exist in our country. That day, we got a call from the rabbi of our neighborhood. And I will read a bit from the book, from the chapter called Welcome the Stranger. I have never been inside a mosque, Rabbi Benny Weinberg said to Khalid. Khalid is my husband. Khalid called the Islamic Cultural Center of New York, made an appointment for the rabbi to meet the imam after the Jummah Friday prayers. Should I remove my kippah? The rabbi asked as he entered the mosque. Keep it on. The rabbi was very noticeable in the mosque as a Jewish person. He sat down on the prayer rug beside Khalid, listened to the imam's sermon, and stood shoulder to shoulder with the congregation in prayer. As soon as the prayer was over, people started walking up to the rabbi. Thank you for coming, they said as they shook his hand. A distinguished-looking elderly man, dressed in a white shalwar kameez, walked up to the rabbi. I would like to give you a gift, but I have nothing on me. He then held out his hand and showed the rabbi his prayer beads. This is my tasbih. It is a family heirloom, which I treasure. I would like you to have it. He placed the prayer beads in the rabbi's hands. Those are the moments when I remember and recall Martin Luther King saying, only in the darkness can you see the stars. Rabbi, your mother was a refugee too.
That's right, Sabia. My mother.
Did I just call you Rabbi?
I guess you did. You transferred from Mark Schneider to you did. You made me a rabbi now. Thank you. Well, a lot of people make that mistake. Don't worry. Anyway, my mother, Helga Ringel, she was born in Germany before the Nazis came to power, and at the age of 14, she and her own mother fled on foot, ran across the border into Belgium on foot. And that's how they escaped Germany. But that was only the beginning of a 3-year odyssey before they were able to get here. And they spent a good piece of that time in France trying to get a visa to America, but it was closed basically. That was the first time of America First, and America did not want these desperate Jews who were trying to save their lives. The Nazis came to France. They managed to flee to Portugal, but then they were stuck there. Eventually, they got on a boat. They managed to secure visas to Ecuador. You could get anything if you could find the money, and they spent their last money on visas actually. So when they arrived eventually here in the States, they were without any money. So they took a boat to New York. My grandmother at that point, the organization HIAS, with Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which took my grandmother from the boat into the city to see if they could find someone to take responsibility, to say that they were his relatives and would take responsibility. They eventually did find such a person. He was actually a New York City judge with the same last name. So he signed this affidavit, and I don't know to this day whether he actually believed they were really his relatives, but he did take responsibility. So that's how they got to stay in America. During that week, though, while this was all going on, my mother, who was then 16, was held on Ellis Island as surety to make sure that my grandmother would actually come back. So you can see some of the parallels with today. And in fact, my mother lived a long and wonderful life in America, and I think she made a lot of contributions in terms of her work, her political activism. She was a big supporter of the civil rights movement, among other things. So after her passing, I'd say about 11 or she passed in 2005, and in 2018, I was invited to speak at a rally in front of the Supreme Court in Washington, where they were appealing to the Supreme Court not to uphold the Muslim ban, the so-called travel ban, which was really a Muslim ban that had been put into effect by the Trump administration. And so I had the great fortune, I feel, to tell my mother's story, that's just as I'm telling it to you, and then to say, everything that she experienced back in the 40s, with coyotes and all these, being ripped off by, coyotes and and all this stuff, and being just sort of a non-human, non-person. All of that was happening even as we spoke to Muslims from Syria, from Yemen, from Iran, from Afghanistan, fleeing life-threatening violence and being cold-shouldered by America. And so we don't care if you live or die, basically. That's what my mother went through. Trump sneered at these people as illegals, as though they were some kind of subhuman. Well, my mother was an illegal too when she got here, and she ended up making a huge contribution to America. So that's why that welcome the stranger is so central to Sabeeha and myself and both of our peoples. The third principle is Islah and Tikkun Olam. Islah is an Arabic word which translates roughly as reform. Tikkun Olam is Hebrew for repairing the world. And for me, both of these overlapping concepts convey the common moral imperative in both of our faiths to help those in society who are most at need. And so a big chunk of what we would do in many of the twinning events, it was social action, that we would, social action, community service. We would do a lot of going out and feeding hungry and homeless people. And we would visit sick and elderly people, which is something that's enjoined in both of our books, holy books. We did environmental cleanups. We did health fairs, bringing doctors from both faiths to serve people without insurance for free. And it was so meaningful to stand together, Muslims and Jews side by side, in aprons in a homeless shelter, and serve hot food to hungry people. And that just really brought us together and helped us build relationships between ourselves in a very, very palpable way, doing that service together. There was really nothing better than that. Sabeeha?
The fourth principle that unites us is standing up for each other. It was a bright, sunny Sunday in February 2017, actually a cold day as well, soon after the travel ban was announced, when my husband and I walked into Times Square in New York City and found ourselves surrounded by people holding up posters, "Today I am a Muslim too," except that they were not Muslim. They had come to stand in solidarity with their fellow Muslim Americans. As I walked through the crowd, I came across a woman in a wheelchair. She must have been in her 90s. She could barely lift her head. And I thought about what it took for her to be there. Somebody had to have helped her get into her woolen coat, put her in a wheelchair, brought her out by the curbside, hailed a cab, put her in the car, folded the wheelchair, all of that just to get her into Times Square so that she could protest loudly with her silence and her presence. These people on a Sunday, on their day off, could have been anywhere, hundreds of them, but they chose to come and stand in solidarity with us. And not too long after, the tables were reversed, and now it was time for the Muslims to stand up for their fellow Jewish Americans. Tell us about it, Walter.
Well, the date that's so vivid in my mind till this moment, we just passed, I think, the third anniversary. It was October 27th, 2018. And on that morning, I woke up, I think it was a Sunday morning, and I turned on the TV to watch the Sunday shows. And I was horrified beyond words to what I was seeing on CNN, which was that finding out that a neo-Nazi gunman had erupted into the Tree of Life synagogue in my hometown of Pittsburgh and had murdered 11 Jews at prayer. And at that moment, it was, I can't even convey, because nothing like this had ever happened before in the history of the United States. Going back to when George Washington first appeared in the synagogue in Newport to welcome the Jews, and Newport, Rhode Island. And, so it was, so to witness this, I just had this feeling, my God, for the first time in my life, I don't feel safe as a Jew in America. And as I'm experiencing that just sense of existential dread, I see on the TV screen a group of men in Muslim dress who were holding up signs standing outside of the police line near the Tree of Life, holding up signs, "We love you, we're here for you, tell us what we can do." And, you know, it was very meaningful for me because I knew that the Tree of Life, they were from the Islamic Center Society of Pittsburgh, and I knew that there was a previous relationship between those two congregations. And so, you know, it really showed me that was very, you know, very meaningful. But the other thing was that they commenced fundraising, the Muslim group, and on behalf of the Tree of Life, and within it became a national fundraising effort, and within 3 days, they had raised several hundred, more than $200,000. All very, very powerful for me, for not only me as a Jew, but so many Jews that our Muslim brothers and sisters were doing that at that moment. And then came the following weekend, the following Shabbat, there were services in synagogues across America in tribute to the Tree of Life. And what was so noteworthy was that thousands and thousands of non-Jews came to those services spontaneously, and just showed up. And I was in a synagogue in Northern Virginia, where I think it was just bursting to capacity, and so many of those who did come, people surrounding me in the social hall were Muslim. And I remember a youngish man, probably in his late 30s. He was, you know, we were all kind of crowded together, and he was there with his 2 small children. And, you know, we made eye contact a few times, and finally I just was so moved. I embraced him. I came forward and I said, "I just want to let you know how meaningful this is for me. But I do have a question." I said to him, you decided to bring your kids, and is there, I just was curious if you felt you weren't concerned that maybe this would be too much for them, you know, at such a young age. And he said, "Absolutely not. I have to be here when my brothers and sisters are under attack. They have to be here. They have to see this. They have to absorb this. This has to become a life lesson for them. And we have to be here." What can I say? Sabeeha talked about the light and the darkness that Martin Luther King talked about, and that was that moment for me, and it stays with me every day. So very, very, very powerful.
It hasn't always been easy. One of the challenges that I continue to face on this journey is it is very difficult to get Muslims involved in interfaith activism. I am not sure what the issue is. It could be that for the immigrant Muslims, we are still a young community in terms of not having quite evolved to that degree where activism is important for us. It could also be that my children's generation, they're still young, have their jobs, their kids, but it could also be lack of trust, mistrust. And that is, all of these are issues that we need to overcome, and they continue to pose a challenge on this journey. Walter, you've had your challenges.
Well, absolutely, Sabeeha. And whenever Sabeeha talks about the challenges she's faced in the Muslim community, I say, look, I've faced many of the same challenges in the Jewish community as well. You know, having worked in Muslim-Jewish relations in many cities across the country, you know, I've seen in some cities, the Muslim community tends to be pulled back, and in some cities, it's the Jewish community. And fortunately, in many cities, it's been absolutely great, you know, but you know, we do have these issues. So why does that happen? And on both sides, I guess you could say. And I think one of them is the Israel-Palestine conflict. Frankly, the first element, we call them the 2 elephants in the room. The first elephant is the Israeli-Palestine conflict. And over the years, I mean, whenever there's eruptions of violence in the Holy Land, we see that it has a deleterious effect on our work here. What happens usually is that the people who, you know, when I was arranging these twinning events, you know, I would depend, the rabbi and the imam in LA had already formed the relationship, and I assumed that they're going to, you know, go forward and make it happen when, you know, the time is right. We usually do November, December. So by the, you know, somewhere in September, I'm calling the rabbi there, and I'm saying, well, have you talked to Imam X about, you know, and he would say to me, I could see he was, you know, really embarrassed. I mean, I couldn't see him, but I could hear it in his voice that, you know, he said, you know, I haven't done it yet, Walter. I'm so sorry. I'll do it. But, you know, it's just been it's just been very painful to talk about this stuff right now, and you know, I don't want to have, you know, so I've been kind of avoiding that conversation. So I had to keep pushing, and eventually things would get back on track. And you know, that's the good news. But what I got out of that was the importance, if you built that relationship, pick up the phone. Don't do avoidance. And in terms of the second elephant, these are doctrines in our holy books that offend the other, and we've got plenty of problematical passages in both in both the Quran and the Torah. I myself was, I have to say, troubled by when I read the Quran for the first time, how the Jews were presented there, the children of Israel, and basically it was about, they were looking back on the times of the Exodus in the Old Testament in the Quran, and what came through to me in you know, the English translation was kind of an angry condemning of the children of Israel for betraying God, you know, during their sojourn in the desert. Moses went up and brought down the 10 commandments. He came down, he sees them over there worshiping the golden calf, you know, but there's a very kind of hectoring tone, and it bothered me, and I would express my hurt to my Muslim friends. So I did pick up the phone, and I asked them about this, and sometimes Muslim scholars and imams, they would say to me, but Walter, you know, it says almost the same thing in the Torah about how the Jews betrayed God's commands. And what about that? And I thought, you know, I went back and looked at the Torah again. Can't say I read it all that much, but you know, there it was. Yeah, many of the same things. And so what right did why was I getting upset? Well, you know, I think it was I know it is this tendency that all of us have in our groups, you know, the various communities, individuals with those communities themselves. You know, it's okay for us to criticize ourselves within our own tent. It's okay for us even to laugh at ourselves, you know, out there, you know, have Jewish comedians making fun of being Jewish. Muslim comedians are doing that, you know, African American, on and on and on. But God forbid somebody else says something similar, you know, then it's already anti-Semitism, it's Islamophobia, it's racism. That's the tendency. Again, just to finish this, though, what I wanted to say was that pick up the phone. I mean, I felt a lot better. I was able to kind of deal with those things. I got some context, and able to go on and be, you know, continue this Muslim-Jewish peace and not feel like the Muslims were my enemy. But, you know, there's things you have to work through sometimes.
So Walter and I have, after, you know, going through on this journey, we wrap it up in our book with some of the lessons that we have learned, which we would like to share with you just briefly. And the first one is that we are Americans first. And whereas the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts means much to us, we feel deeply about it, we live here. And unless Muslims and Jews can come together here in America and not let the Middle East conflict divide us here at home, we run the risk of losing democracy and losing pluralism. We saw what happened in January 6th. That is just the prologue. We are seeing what's happening with the voting rights. And if democracy is threatened, we minority faith communities stand to lose. It's very important that we stick together. Second is that speak out and stay engaged when injustices, and get engaged and speak out against injustices both here and abroad. Number three, Muslims and Jews should support the work of NGOs in Israel, Palestine that are doing work on the ground to save lives. An example of that is Project Rosanna that Walter is involved in which the Palestinian sick children, sick with cancer and needing dialysis, are brought over from Palestine into Israel hospitals for treatment every day and then brought back. They are responsible for transporting them back and forth daily, saving lives. Number four, allow others to speak out, whether you agree with them or not. We know that Representatives Tlaib and Omar have said things that have hurt the feelings of people in the Jewish community. but they have as much of a right to speak up for what they stand for as do the Jewish senators like Ben Cardin and Chuck Schumer. And number 5, don't allow Israel-Palestine to be weaponized in ways that draw our communities apart. Number 6, let's not denigrate or demonize people on either side. Activists like Linda Sarsour correctly demand that they be allowed to speak out freely as Palestinian Americans, but we take issue when Zionists are demonized. Number 7, Muslims should engage with mainstream American Jews who consider themselves Zionists rather than allying themselves exclusively with anti-Zionist groups. And likewise, Jews should engage with Muslims like Tlaib and Omar so that they can work together on causes that they both support, even though they disagree on the Middle East issue. And finally, let's be cautious about labeling one another as Islamophobic or anti-Semitic. Criticizing Israel's policies and its leaders is just that. It's a criticism of the policies and the leaders. It is not a criticism of the Jews. Similarly, leaders and policies of Muslim countries, same thing. It does not translate into Islamophobia. But we do need to remain sensitive to the sensibilities of both communities so that our comments are not misconstrued as being Islamophobic or anti-Semitic, particularly if they were not meant to be as such. And with that, we bring our formal presentation to a closure, and thank you for listening, and we're open to taking your questions now.
Thank you.
So far, there are no questions, but we will wait a minute.
Well, if there are no questions while we are waiting, please feel free to pick up a copy of this book and please read it. It has a lot more detail in it, some very interesting and moving stories. And if you like the book, tell your friends about it. Thank you.
I do want to say that I did read your other book through.
Threading
and
my
I
prayer
loved it.
rug.
I
Thank you.
loved it. It was a
Thank you.
wonderful, it gave you such an insight to the different things that happened during that time of your life, and also the customs that you just don't know. And everyone has different customs,
Mhm.
religious, ethnic, and it was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. And
Thank
you're a good writer.
Yeah,
Thanks. Thanks.
Okay, here we go. I think I have a question here. Oh, this is from Catherine Payton. This has to, have you heard of the folk song Tree of Life? It speaks to the power of women working on quilts. Maybe it could be a help to the cause of people joining together with these important matters and bridging gaps. Okay.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing it to our attention. I was not aware of it.
I wasn't either, but it does sound very
Thank
powerful. I
you.
just wonder, was it written after the Tree of Life massacre? I don't know if we know that. I did, that would be interesting to know.
It's an old folk song, and it
Oh, it is.
talks to many different quilting patterns and the idea of many hands working together. And it's kind of a peace activist song. So probably from the folk singing world, you find a lot of songs to enrich the things you're saying. Stand together and welcome the stranger. This is really
Yes.
beautiful. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you, Catherine. Gail Allen said, I appreciate the commonalities and insights you shared. Thank you. Thank you, Gail. And there's one new message. That was it. Oh, here we go. From Tony Siegel. Clearly, pardon me?
Still typing.
Oh, it says one new message here. I apologize, Tony.
The second one.
I will wait.
So let me tell you a story about Tony's and my interaction with a friend from Pakistan, not a friend. So when our family visits from Pakistan, you know, they want to see all the touristy places. But we, my husband and I, we take them to the Empire State and the Statue of Liberty, but we also take them to a Sabbath service and to the St. Patrick's Cathedral. So one day Khalid's niece was visiting from Pakistan and we took her to BJ. And Tony was there and my other friends were there.
You want to say what BJ is?
Right.
B'nai Jeshurun on the Upper West Side, the synagogue. That's my synagogue. Khalid and I call it our synagogue. So we were there and she picked up the prayer book and she's looking at it and she's saying, if I didn't read the cover, I would think I'm reading the Quran. And then everybody gets around and now they're dancing and singing and she's like, oh, this is fun. And afterwards, Tony suggested, let's go out for dinner. So we went to a diner and we had dinner. And now Tony and my friend Jenny, also from BJ, they're giving her all kinds of ideas on places that you can see as a tourist. And she's so floored by this experience, comes back to our apartment, spends half the night writing to her mother and her sister saying, I just had this amazing experience. I went to a Sabbath service. I met these very nice Jewish ladies. They were so helpful to me. They were giving me all these ideas and just spread the good feeling. Thank you,
That's
Tony.
very nice. Oh, well, I'd like to read to you what Tony's finished now writing, right?
Yes, I'm finished writing.
Okay.
It takes a while.
So, yes, that's fine. Clearly, you both have found each other and have open minds. But how do you suggest making common cause with people who aren't so eager to make friends?
So great question. I posed this question to someone once who had come to Chautauqua and was giving a talk. And she said, you know, if you want to win hearts and minds, don't give an academic lecture. Don't quote statistics. Tell your stories. So I went up to the mic and I said, you know, my husband and I are trying to do that. And, you know, I've even written a book and we go all over the US. People invite us. We go and we tell our stories, but we feel that we are preaching to the choir. And we are only being invited by people who are willing to listen. How do we get to take our message to those who are not willing to listen to us, who are not inviting us? How do we get them to invite us to come? And she said, these people will not invite you, but they will invite me, meaning herself, and people like me. So tell us your stories and we will tell your stories to them. Number two, don't overestimate the open-mindedness of your audience. Don't overestimate. The skeptics were there and they came and they listened. And that's a start. And I realized how right she was when a few years later, a woman that I had befriended in one of our interfaith groups, after a meeting, we were walking home together and she said, Sabeeha, now I can tell you this. But when we heard that our organization was holding your book talk, I and my friends, Jewish, all of them, decided that, okay, we'll go listen to her, but we are not going to buy her book. After the talk was over, she said, we all lined up and every one of us picked up the book. And that's when I realized that what that woman had said was so true. You know, the skeptics are there and, you know, it is a start, but I really appreciated that she told me this, you know, I mean, we had come a long way in our relationship that she could say that, she could tell me that. Thanks, Tony. Great question.
That's very nice. And this last one is another comment by Catherine Payton. Abe Lincoln said, e pluribus unum, and out of the many, one. Do you have suggestions for more people to join in the efforts along the lines of sister cities, twinning in terms of schools and interfaith efforts? Would it make sense to have a Christian Jewish Muslim alliance and forming teams too, so more of that may assist this work?
Yeah, so thank you, Catherine. We do have Muslim, Christian, Jewish alliances. There's the Daughters of Abraham. And in fact, Walter and I have been giving book talks. Just recently, Jacksonville, Florida. We have one in New York. And I think that's something that is nationwide. We have scriptural reasoning where the three Abrahamic faiths get together and we read our scriptures. Tony and I belong to an interfaith book club where we have people of all the three faiths, reading books that just help. It could be novels, memoirs, anything for that matter. Just a few examples of that. But Walter, go ahead.
Right. I just wanted to give a bit of the philosophical thinking about that. This is something that, in other words, why people ask me all the time, and I think it's a good question. So why are you so just Muslim Jewish? Why aren't you interfaith? Well, the answer is that I'm both, and we're both. But we feel that it is very important that that the Muslim Jewish thing, that dialogue, that effort needs to happen within its own context, because our two faiths have been so estranged for such a long time, more than 100 years, you could say, and maybe much more than that, that we, that even, and much of it about Israel, Palestine, but even here, 6,000 miles away, when I came into this, I could see Muslims and Jews just kind of avoiding each other, and I understood how essential it is that we have that conversation within Muslim Jewish. That's the core. That's a big, so that's what much of my work has been in. But we also feel it's absolutely essential, and I take part in interfaith work all the time as well, because that's one piece of a larger alliance building thing, which absolutely involves many of the causes that and groups that Sabeeha was just telling you about. And it's very, very important. And we all need to come together in support of the values that, that are not only Muslim Jewish, that I talked about pluralism and religious freedom and democracy. This is something that's vital for all of us. So yeah, that's absolutely very, very important.
Thank you, Walter. Another comment is from Tony, and it says, you talked a lot about similarities. I imagine it is harder to speak about differences, or is it?
Yeah, it is hard to speak about differences because it's awkward, and when you're friends, you really don't want to hurt the other's feelings. But Walter and I, had come a long way in our relationship, and at one point, while writing the book, we felt, okay, we can talk about it. And I remember I was in the car. Walter was driving me to the American University, and I just turned on the phone, the recording, and we started dialoguing. And he's driving, and we're talking, and we're debating. And at one point, I remember saying, "It's not fair," and Walter saying, "Yes, it's not fair, but life's not fair." And all that is in the book. So we had a whole chapter devoted to the elephant in the room, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where he and I debate. But the following chapter, Walter raised another issue. He said, and he said earlier, there are difficult passages in our scriptures, and there is a belief that the Quran is anti-Semitic. So we have that debate, and what that did, not only were we open to having that conversation, but that also educated both of us, me more than Walter, because he kept asking me questions, and it compelled me to go back to my bookshelf, get books, call scholars, email them, try and find the answers, and actually felt my mind expanding and growing thanks to Walter asking all these questions. But we did have those difficult conversations. We did talk about our scriptures. Later, there is a chapter called Putting Sarah and Hagar's Conflict to Rest, where we went over location. Was it Beersheba? Was it Mecca? No, it's Beersheba. Yes, it's Mecca. Did this really happen? Did Sarah throw Hagar out? We've had all those conversations. They're all in the book. But it happened because we were at a point in our relationship where we felt comfortable doing that, and it survived. We survived. Yeah, we survived it.
And that's lovely. That's kind of what relationships are about. If you could get through those difficult times, it's a real gift.
Walter, did you want to add to that?
I think you summed it up very well, except we not only survived, but we thrived. I would just add that point. I mean, I think it enhanced our relationship greatly, and you know, it's really, really wonderful. It certainly wasn't easy for me or fun to kind of raise these issues in the Quran that with Sabeeha, who I already liked and respected so greatly, and I, you know, the last thing one wants to do. But yeah, that you get to a point where you just, you know, if the relationship is worth anything, honesty has got to be a big part of it, and it helps us grow, and it helped, you know, the book wouldn't have happened without being able to do that.
Well, that's terrific. Well, I think that's it. I have no more questions. I do want to thank you both for being with us this evening. And I do want to let everyone know that we do have a copy of We Refuse to Be Enemies at the library, and also the Threading My Prayer Rug, One Woman's Journey from Pakistani Muslim to American Muslim by Sabia Raymond. So please come by and take it out. I'm bringing this back tomorrow.
So I have a request, if I
Yes.
may. So if any of you have had a chance to read the book or are reading the book, when you've read it, may I ask if you could put an honest comment on Goodreads and on Amazon? It does bring attention to the book, you know, if more people are talking about it. It's helpful to us, it's helpful to the readers, so
Oh,
much
great.
appreciated. Yeah.
Yeah, that
Great.
would be
Thank
wonderful.
you. Thank you. We'll do
Thank
that.
you. Thank you.
All right. So I say goodbye to everyone, and I thank you again.
Yeah, thanks, Walter. Thanks, Erica.
It was
Thank
great.
you. Have a good
Thank
evening,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you, Tony.
Bye-bye.
Good evening.